Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Measures of Progress, a show where we help you to get better acquainted with some of history's favorite pieces of classical music and get newly acquainted with awesome music being composed today. Hi, I'm Kira.
I'm Glenda.
And I'm Emily.
For our pilot episode, we chose a piece that is near and dear to our heart as oboe players, Le Tombeau de Couperin by Maurice Ravel.
Le Tombeau de Couperin, in its best-known version, is an orchestral piece in 4 movements entitled Prelude, Fourlaine, Minuet, and Rigaudon. However, it was originally composed as a piano piece that has 2 extra movements, not included in the orchestral version, the toccata and the fugue. For this episode, since we're a bunch of orchestral musicians, we'll be talking about the orchestra version of Tombeau, more so than the keyboard version.
Sorry, piano players.
Sorry.
Ravel composed the piano version between 1914 and 1917, right in the midst of the First World War, and completed the orchestral version in 1919.
Obviously, the First World War had a huge impact on Ravel and his music. He was personally involved in the war as an ambulance driver and a nurse, and in a Captain America-esque move, he tried to join the French Air Force but was rejected due to being too young and having heart problems. And he wasn't able to join the infantry due to his smaller stature.
Wow, the OG Captain America.
The OG Captain America.
All right, I actually didn't know that.
That's what it's based on, definitely.
I like to think so. In 1914, the same year that Ravel composed the Tombeau de Couperin, Germany invaded France, and France suffered the most staggering and grievous losses it had ever seen up until that point. The influence of these horrible events can clearly be seen in Ravel's compositions. The word tombeau itself translates into English as tomb, and it is a reference to a 17th century musical term that means memorial. Ravel dedicated each of his 6 movements to a friend or friends that passed during the war. It's interesting because if you listen to the piece of music, a lot of it sounds really joyful and happy and upbeat. You'd never guess that it had these tragic connotations if you didn't know ahead of time.
Yeah, I feel like I had known in the back of my mind that it was kind of a memorial to his friends that passed away, but when you're just practicing it as an audition excerpt, you're like, oh yes, happy trees. Yeah. It's so upbeat and major and beautiful, but actually it's really sad.
Well, I think the whole point is it's more of a celebration of life.
True.
You know, totally. Not all memorials are sad.
Right. Although the original 17th century tombeau musical term generally refer to more of a lament style.
Yeah. So that's what makes this one so interesting and different.
Mm-hmm.
So Ravel obviously was not the only composer that was writing music during World War I, and the war affected different composers in different ways. Between 1915 and 1917, the English composer Edward Elgar wrote a setting of Lawrence Binyon's poem, For the Fallen, for choir and orchestra. This somber and reverent musical response to the war is contrasted by Austrian composer Alban Berg, who began work on his atonal expressionist opera Wojciech in 1914. A third example comes from Igor Stravinsky, who wrote his quirky and vibrant chamber piece, L'Histoire du Soldat, which is translated as The Soldier's Tale in 1918. Though this piece was completed after the war had ended and is based on a Russian story rather than real events, it obviously still has ties and connotations with the war.
During this time in history, a number of isms arose in all types of art. We mentioned Expressionism with Alban Berg, which is a movement that aims to depict subjective emotions rather than objective reality and tends to be jarring and somewhat bizarre. So think the painting The Scream by Edvard Munch. Another important movement that was gaining popularity around this time was neoclassicism, which is an artistic style inspired by traditions, art, and culture from antiquity. In the context of the earth-shattering effects of the war, neoclassicism was a way for composers to return to the aesthetics and styles of this idea of classicism. So you could argue that neoclassicism was kind of an expression of nostalgia and a way to remember the past rather than kind of barging forward into the unknown in the more harsh and unpredictable way that proponents of expressionism did. Neoclassicism is also considered to be a reaction to the unrestrained emotions and the perceived formlessness of music in the late Romantic period. So Ravel and Stravinsky both are credited with initiating this movement during and after the war.
Which is funny because when you think of Stravinsky, like, it's completely different from Ravel.
Yeah,
Totally,
yeah.
yeah.
Wouldn't totally group them together, but
I guess it depends what piece you're looking at for Stravinsky. Like,
yes.
his Rite of Spring is not.
And
Neoclassicism.
Rite of Spring, Tombeau doesn't really.
Yeah.
Definitely.
He went through a massive transformation
Yeah.
throughout his compositional career.
Rite of Spring is definitely not neoclassic. Like, surely
No,
it's not,
definitely.
right?
No, it's like that's like
I mean, I feel like that's
expressionist, right?
Yeah.
like the epitome of unrestrained emotion.
Yeah. Unrestrained something at least.
For sure.
It's great. We all love Rite of Spring.
Yeah, it's a great piece. Go listen.
Yeah,
We'll talk about it later.
we will.
We'll get to it.
In the realm of visual arts, one important style that arose during World War I was Dadaism. This movement is characterized by satire and nonsense, more similar to Expressionism than Neoclassicism. An example of art in this style that you may have heard of is Marcel Duchamp's sculpture called Fontaine, which is basically just an upside-down urinal with the signature R. Mutt written on the side.
Another significant artistic movement of this period was Cubism, which was initiated by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Artworks in the Cubist style aim to present an object from multiple different perspectives at the same time, so they all look quite abstract. Before the war, Cubist artworks were more innovative and modern, but during the war, artists tended towards a style that was more flat and structured, and Cubism never really regained the avant-garde impetus that it had before the war.
Which is also kind of interesting because I feel like some art movements became like more modern and contemporary after the war, and then other ones kind of like receded in that. So I guess
Yeah,
that's
they
a-
responded in different ways.
Yeah.
Well, I think the war just created such a divide.
Yeah,
you know,
definitely.
It's just such a massive thing that the whole world, society, culture, it was shook, you know. And so some people were kind of not stuck in the past, but like wanting that.
Yeah.
And others were like, no, this is a time to like move on and find something new.
It's like how different people responded differently to being in isolation during the pandemic. Some of us stayed in their bed for like a year and were just depressed.
Oh no!
And then other people did like cool projects and stuff.
I know, it made me feel more depressed.
Final interesting tidbit of artistic lore is the introduction of jazz music to France. This occurred, at least in its early stages, during the war when African-American Allied soldiers were stationed in France. Jazz would later become a significant influence on Ravel's compositions when the genre began to become more popular, and in particular when he visited the United States in 1928. So there isn't much in the way of jazz influences in Le Tombeau de Couperin specifically, but if you listen to some of Ravel's later music, you might be able to hear jazz-inspired elements.
Let's move on to talking about the structure of the piece now. Tombeau is a piece that would definitely be classified as neoclassical. There are a lot of references to historical traditions and movements in the construction of this piece. Ravel composed this piece following the traditions of the Baroque suite, particularly following the style of the French harpsichord suite, or suite française. Another neoclassical element of this piece is the name Couperin in the title. François Couperin was a French Baroque composer who was considered a master at composing for keyboard instruments. By honoring him in the title of his piece, Ravel is kind of playing an homage to the whole 17th to 18th century French school of keyboard playing. So not only is it an homage to his friends that he lost during the war, it's also kind of a dedication to the past as a general concept.
Tombeau begins with a melodious and virtuosic prelude that is characterized by ornamentation and perpetual motion. The opening melody is played by the oboe, and it is one of our big points of pride in the orchestral literature, as well as being the bane of our existence because it's really hard. Much easier on keyboard, I assume.
Oh, I can imagine.
Oh.
Like,
That's
You
just a
just-
warm
you
up for
just-
them.
yeah. It is an orchestral excerpt that every single oboist has played 1,000 times and still has to spend hours working on for every audition we take. It's not just difficult for oboists, however. The writing for all the woodwinds is quite virtuosic, and it's very challenging and delicate for the strings as well.
The second movement is called Forlan and is styled after the Italian Baroque dance of the same name. It's a lively and bouncy movement that sounds more quote-unquote modern than some of the others due to its funky harmonies. There are a lot of augmented and diminished chords, dissonant notes, modulations to distantly related keys, and prominent tritones and major sevenths in the main melody. The oboe also has some tricky solos in this movement that are often included on audition lists as well. We're required to play snappy staccatos in our low register, as well as gentle tinkling grace notes in our super, super high third octave range.
So hard.
It's very hard.
The next movement after the Forlan is the minuet. A minuet is also a type of dance that has a simple, unelaborated melody. Takes a bit of a slower tempo and usually has a trio section in the middle. It's usually in 3/4 time, like a waltz, but unlike a waltz where the first beat is emphasized, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Like that.
But unlike a waltz, the beats are a lot more equal in weight in the minuet. The whole minuet movement of the Tombeau de Couperin is a solo oboe feature, and we're often asked to play the entire movement for auditions. It is beautiful, lyrical, and light, and is also quite challenging to play because of the control that is demanded in the high register of the oboe.
The last movement in the orchestral version of Tombeau is the Rigaudon. A rigaudon, like the Forlan and the minuet, is also a Baroque dance. It is characterized by a duple meter and hopping steps, as well as a pretty upbeat tempo. Traditionally, they usually start with an upbeat or a pickup, but Ravel's Rigaudon is unusual in that it starts on a downbeat. That's definitely not a detail you would notice when listening to the piece unless you're intimately familiar with Baroque dance styles.
The oboe does have one more solo in the slower middle section of the Rigaudon movement. This one isn't usually asked on auditions because it's comparatively a lot simpler than the rest of the piece, but it's a very beautiful, lilting, and kind of dark melody, and when it passes off to the clarinet, it sounds like the sun is coming out, and it is gorgeous.
Kira from the future here. We actually got this wrong. The oboe passes the melody off to the English horn, not the clarinet. Sorry to confuse anyone. Our mistake. Anyways, here's a little clip of that passage, and then we'll be back to the episode.
This has been a brief introduction of Ravel's Le Tombeau de Couperin. We've given you a sneak peek of what the piece is like, but we hope you'll go listen to it on your own time now that you know all these cool facts about history and composition. In the last section of our show, we'll be introducing you to a contemporary piece that kind of has the same vibe as the main piece that we've been talking about. For this episode, the piece that we've chosen to pair with Le Tombeau de Couperin is Canopies by Canadian composer and violist Leo Purich.
Leo is based in Montreal, Quebec, and is currently completing a double degree in music theory and composition at McGill University. He has received multiple commissions over the past few years from various chamber ensembles, orchestras, and choirs in Quebec, as well as the National Youth Orchestra of Canada, who commissioned the piece Canopies. Some of the significant influences on his compositional style include classics like Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, as well as Fanny Mendelssohn and Grażyna Bacewicz, who was an early to mid-20th century composer whose music had neoclassical and folk influences, as well as strong rhythmic energy that was influential for Leo when he was composing Canopies. Other styles and genres that have influenced Leo's composition are jazz, Quebecois folk music, and Balkan folk music.
Canopies is an orchestral piece that was commissioned by the National Youth Orchestra of Canada in 2020. It was meant to be premiered that year as a celebration of the National Youth Orchestra's 60th anniversary, but it didn't end up being premiered until their 2022 season due to gestures broadly.
You know what?
You know what.
That big thing that happened.
It's a really fun and exuberant piece that was written with celebratory intent and meant to evoke the youthful sense of joy that comes from making music together.
Yeah, I actually had the pleasure of performing in the premiere of the piece during NYO's 2022 season, and I can confirm that it is a joyful experience from both the audience and the performer's perspective. I'm pretty sure I had a big goofy smile on my face every time we rehearsed and performed the piece because it was just so much fun.
Leo had the opportunity to compose this piece after being one of the winners of the SOCAN Foundation Young Composers Award in 2019. The National Youth Orchestra and the SOCAN Foundation have an agreement where NYO will choose from these winners, and they'll do a full orchestral reading of their music during the summer session. Because of you-know-what, Leo didn't actually get to do the reading session, but NYO still ended up commissioning him to write for the 2020 season, so it all worked out. Leo has also been the recipient of one of the SOCAN Awards in 2020.
I actually had the chance recently to speak with Leo about this piece and his compositional process and the ideas that went into it. And he told me this cool story about the kind of light bulb moment he had where the concept for the piece kind of clicked. So apparently he was just walking in the forest, looking up at the canopy, hence the name, above him, the tree canopy, and saw how so many separate smaller elements like the leaves and the branches and each individual tree kind of came together to form this collaborative, unified whole. So Leo likened this concept to the orchestra itself as well, which is made up of, between 50 to 100 separate individual people, each playing their own instrument. But somehow when they all play together, it forms this beautiful, unified entity of its own. Another forest-themed idea of Leo's that comes across in his orchestration is this concept of seeing the same structures occurring throughout different levels or layers and existing in different variations and at different scales. So when you're listening to this piece, hopefully right after this episode, you'll be able to hear the same theme being played over and over, but sometimes it will be played by different sections of the orchestra, or sometimes it will be expanded or condensed or fragmented, but it's this unifying, overarching theme that kind of defines the whole piece. Also, when you're listening, make sure you pay close attention because Leo informed me that he did include the infamous lick somewhere in the piece. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the lick,
This lick.
the lick is
I know this lick.
the lick.
Yes,
you know?
I now know it. Sorry.
It's a huge meme in the music student world, and it refers to this way overused melodic pattern that's usually found in jazz solos. And then we'll play
I'll add a clip here.
So that excellent meme exists in some form in Canopies, and if you find it, please tell me where it is because I swear I rehearsed this piece for 2 weeks and performed it 4 or 5 times on tour last summer, and I never noticed it.
Too well disguised.
It's well disguised. The decision to include this piece alongside Le Tombeau de Couperin was, I will admit, largely based off of vibes, but there are some interesting parallels between the two. First of all, Tombeau is composed in the neoclassical style, which we talked about earlier in the episode. And I would argue that Canopies has kind of a neoclassical vibe as well. It's lighthearted and pretty easy to digest and comfortable to listen to while also referencing styles and conventions that came before it.
Also, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, Ravel was inspired by the French Baroque harpsichord suite when composing Tombeau. And he famously drew inspiration from jazz music throughout his compositional career following World War I. When composing Canopies, Leo was also listening to and drawing from both the Baroque and big band jazz music, considering those genres to exemplify his idea of joyful, collective music making. There's also an obvious theme of nature in Canopies, with all of its conceptual references to the forest, and in Le Tombeau de Couperin, it's kind of difficult not to hear musical references to nature throughout, despite the fact that it might not have been composed with that intention in mind.
That about does it for our first episode of Measures of Progress. We hope you enjoyed learning about these 2 fabulous pieces of music. To listen to Canopies, you can check out NYO Canada's Borealis album from 2022, wherever you listen to music. If you want to hear more of Leo Purich's music, you can visit leopurich.ca. That's leopurich.ca for directions to his YouTube, Bandcamp, or Instagram pages. Links will be posted in the description.
And make sure to tune in to our next episode where we'll be discussing a piece about an ancient storyteller.
Make sure to like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and feel free to comment or email us at measuresofprogress@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at measuresofprogresspod.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.